Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today I'm looking at a glossy WOLED gaming monitor from Asus, the ROG Strix OLED XG27AQDMG. An absolute shocker of a name, approaching Acer levels of bad naming. But this is a product that a lot of people have been asking for. Take the WOLED panel from other gaming monitors, then instead of giving it a matte coating, give it a glossy coating for the clarity and black levels that some crave. What we're looking at here is a variant of the 27-inch 1440p 240Hz WOLEDs that started hitting the market early last year. This isn't just a straight swap of the screen coating from matte to glossy. This is a newer generation of LG WOLED technology that also brings a few advantages like higher brightness. But from a basic specification standpoint, it's the same size, resolution, and refresh rate as we've seen before. Aside from the much requested glossy coating, the other thing that caught my eye is the price point of just $700 US, though this might just be a short-term launch price with an actual MSRP of $750. Either way, that should be quite competitive given similar WOLEDs currently sit around the $700 US mark. It's good to see Asus giving a price to match the current market rather than trying to justify a higher price than other models. The XG27AQDMG, despite being an ROG Strix product instead of ROG Swift, actually looks pretty similar to the previous PG27AQDM model. The stand has been updated, but the panel section is nearly identical to what we saw before. Same ROG logo below the WOLED panel with thin bezels on all four sides, same central box design on the rear with the thin OLED panel extending outwards, and the same sort of styling. I think it looks pretty reasonable in general, with most outer surfaces being made from plastic. The stand has changed from a three-legged design to a squarish base that sits flat on your desk. It maintains the same level of ergonomic control with height, tilt, swivel, and pivot adjustability, and it's pretty sturdy overall. The base features a cutout that can be used to store your phone. I actually prefer the way this stand looks to what was used on the original PG model, so that's a nice win. Unfortunately, the port selection has not been updated on the new model, still featuring just one DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC and two HDMI 2.0 ports. No issues with the DisplayPort, but only using HDMI 2.0 limits these ports to 144Hz instead of the full 240Hz. This would have been a good opportunity to provide HDMI 2.1. There's also a 2-port USB hub, but no USB-C input or KVM switch functionality. The OSD is a pretty standard affair, controlled through a directional toggle behind the ROG logo on the front. Inside you'll find Asus's typical range of features, including various color modes and controls, a blue light filter, shadow boosting, and various game settings like an FPS counter, crosshairs, and sniper mode. For OLED care features, we get a screensaver, screen shift, and auto logo dimming, in addition to cleaning modes. The big reason people will be interested in the XG27AQDMG is its glossy screen coating. This is the only WOLED-based monitor on the market right now with a glossy finish. All other WOLEDs I'm aware of are either TVs or use a matte finish. Preferring glossy over matte, it's subjective and it will depend on your usage environment and preferences, but it's great to actually get choice here, instead of being forced to use matte or having to deal with the poor glossy coating and panel composition you get with QD-OLEDs. The XG27AQDMG's glossy coating is not identical to what you get with an LG WOLED TV, at least the C2 that I have, but it gets pretty close. Both produce mirror-like reflections and preserve deep blacks, but the TV coating on the C2 does an even better job at minimizing spill and diffusion from light sources reflecting off the panel. The XG monitor's coating is slightly less clear and slightly more diffuse in how it reflects light, while remaining well within the glossy category. LG TVs, in my opinion, have an excellent glossy coating, while the XG27AQDMG is a small step down from that level. Compared to today's 27-inch QD-OLED panels, I'd say this WOLED panel's glossy coating is mostly superior. In brighter rooms, it does a much better job of preserving deep OLED-level blacks without reflecting ambient light, so in many more conditions the screen looks blacker and richer. In darker environments, there's little difference between the two. However, reflection handling is worse than with the QD-OLED panels, so when you do get defined reflections, they are typically brighter on the WOLED side while appearing muted and less visible on a QD-OLED. I'd still give this new WOLED the edge overall, but in some cases a QD-OLED could reduce reflections depending on the positioning of light sources. Compared to previous WOLED monitors with a matte finish, this glossy coating is going to really satisfy those that love the benefits of glossy finishes. Far less light diffusion, giving a generally richer appearance in bright and dim environments, provided reflections can be minimized. And as there's no coating grain, the glossy finish has superior clarity in all conditions. The downside to going glossy is its mirror finish, which has a tendency to reflect yourself and your surrounds in brighter rooms when viewing darker content. In contrast, matte finishes will diffuse this light, making reflections less distracting. As for which option is best overall, I don't think there's a right and wrong answer here. It's going to depend on what you like and what you want to preference. I think this is a great coating, but I don't agree with some glossy fans that say matte monitors are trash. It's still a good solution for cutting out reflections in bright rooms. Among the glossy coatings, I think this is the most versatile for use in a range of conditions, and most gamers should be happy with it. This newer 27-inch WOLED panel uses the same subpixel structure as its predecessor and other 1440p class panels, meaning it's still RWBG. The glossy coating makes text a small amount clearer, but the issues with text clarity still remain, and we've talked about them previously with similar WOLED panels. The non-standard layout can cause some blurring and shadowing for fine elements like text. I don't think it looks very good, and it's a noticeable downgrade over an LCD for text quality. I also find that relative to QD-OLEDs at the same size and resolution, the WOLED subpixel text blurriness looks worse than the color fringing you get from QD-OLED's triangle RGB subpixel structure. In simple terms, LCD looks better than QD-OLED, which looks better than WOLED for text. Asus do have a feature that attempts to compensate for this called Clear Pixel Edge, but from my experience with this monitor and previous Asus WOLEDs, this feature doesn't improve text clarity and if anything makes text slightly blurrier. Combined with the risk of permanent burn-in, this type of WOLED panel isn't well suited to desktop use or productivity work. You shouldn't be concerned about burn-in, or the subpixel layout for that matter, when using OLED for content consumption, like watching videos or playing games. But if you have the same elements on screen for a long period of time, like say the toolbar in an application, that will likely burn in over time, which is why I don't recommend OLED as a productivity monitor. As for burn-in warranty, Asus are matching other major manufacturers by offering a 3-year warranty that covers panel burn-in as explicitly stated on Asus's website. This gives buyers some peace of mind for the first 3 years, although with recent Asus issues around warranties, it's hard to trust this to any significant degree. Asus aren't alone in being difficult when it comes to warranties though, and support varies between regions. Response time performance is excellent on this 240Hz WOLED monitor, as it is for other OLED displays that we've tested so far. OLED offers lightning fast response times around the 0.3 millisecond mark at its maximum 240Hz refresh rate, and that leads to fantastic motion clarity. OLEDs also maintain the same performance at all refresh rates, so even when testing at 120 or 60Hz, we see similar results in the 0.3 millisecond range. This is a nice benefit for variable refresh rate gamers that results in a single overdrive mode experience. In contrast, many LCDs typically perform worse at lower refresh rates relative to their maximum refresh. The major limiting factor to OLED motion performance right now is the refresh rate itself. As a sample and hold monitor, OLEDs do still have some blur in fast motion scenes, and the level of blur depends on the refresh rate. At 240Hz, clarity is superb, but it's not quite as clear as the fastest OLEDs of today that reach 360 or even 480Hz. And when running the display closer to 60Hz, clarity is reduced simply because the refresh rate is reduced, even though response time performance is basically identical at 240 and 60Hz. Still, having such fast response times gives OLED a noticeable advantage over a slower response time LCD running at the same refresh rate. There is effectively no difference in response time performance between this WOLED and other OLED monitors, including QD-OLED variants. This means motion clarity is identical when the refresh rate is the same. However, OLEDs are much faster than even the fastest LCDs I've tested, and this is true whether we look at best performance or average performance across the refresh rate range. Not only are OLEDs fast, but they also have no overshoot artifacts, which can be an issue with some LCD models. When viewing cumulative deviation results, we can see that OLEDs get much closer to ideal response time behavior, and in most cases offer performance an order of magnitude better in this metric than LCDs. In practice, this leads to around a 1.5 times advantage in clarity at a given refresh rate, so 240Hz WOLEDs like the XG27AQDMG offer a similar experience to 360Hz LCDs. The only displays with clearly superior clarity are LCDs that offer elite backlight strobing, a feature that comes with its own set of limitations, like incompatibility with variable refresh rates. Now, Asus do offer a version of backlight strobing with this monitor, ELMB, though as it's an OLED it's more black frame insertion. ELMB on this OLED is very restrictive as it only works at a fixed 120Hz, no other refresh rates are supported, and there's no tuning ability. This is because at 120Hz with eLMB, the monitor is effectively running at 240Hz, just showing every second frame as black. The need for tuning is less on an OLED as there's no difference in clarity between the top and bottom of the screen, as the strobe is perfectly synced across the display, but you can't tune the strobe length, which typically would adjust clarity and brightness. At 120Hz using eLMB does look clearer than not using eLMB, but the implementation is far from perfect. As this is simply showing a black frame every second frame, the non-black image frames have a long strobe length, the length of each refresh cycle, which does lead to some blur relative to a well-strobed LCD that typically would produce a much shorter, sharper pulse. A short image pulse with a long black cycle produces the best image clarity, but this OLED really isn't capable of doing this. All it's doing is running its normal refresh cycle and switching between an image frame and black frame. The end result is that the eLMB mode at 120Hz looks similar, maybe a little clearer than 240Hz without BFI, while being much more restrictive. You have to sacrifice VRR and HDR, the brightness output is lower, and it requires running games at a fixed 120 FPS. It's a nice bonus feature, but I personally wouldn't use it, and it's not able to deliver the crystal clear output of the best backlight strobed LCDs like the Asus PG248QP. Asus are also offering a feature called OLED Anti-Flicker to combat variable refresh rate flicker in rare scenarios. While I was hoping this would be some clever tweak to improve OLED performance during high frame rate fluctuations and stutters, which is usually the trigger for flicker, all it actually does is nerf the VRR range. With the setting off, the monitor uses a 40 to 240Hz range with low frame rate compensation, giving us an effective VRR range of 0 to 240Hz. With anti-flicker on middle, the variable refresh range shrinks drastically to just 160 to 240Hz, and on strong it shrinks further to just 200 to 240Hz. LFC is disabled in these configurations, so any frame rate dips below the minimum refresh rate deactivates VRR and caps the refresh to the minimum. So basically, this feature works by preventing the monitor from hitting low refresh rates and showing flicker due to high refresh fluctuations. But in doing so, VRR becomes almost useless for a lot of gamers. If you're typically gaming in the 100 to 140 FPS range, all anti-flicker will do is disable VRR for you entirely, which fixes one issue while causing another. So this is not the broad solution for OLED flicker that some are looking for. With that said, I generally find OLED VRR flicker to be a rare occurrence across all the monitors I've tested, including the XG27AQDMG. In my experience, it can appear in some game menus or loading screens, but the actual impact in-game is very rare, and I've done thousands of hours of gaming across many games on many OLED monitors at this point. It's not something I can say will never be an issue for you, but it shouldn't be something you see often unless you are experiencing wild frame rate fluctuations, which itself is an issue that should be solved on the PC side. Input latency is excellent, offering just a 0.1 millisecond processing delay in the SDR and HDR modes. Combined with fast response times and a high refresh rate, this OLED feels very snappy to use and is well suited to competitive multiplayer titles. With that said, competing QD-OLED panels are faster, offering a 360Hz refresh rate, which brings with it reduced input lag and better motion clarity. For hardcore competitive gamers, those might be the best option, but otherwise this Asus monitor is very fast. Power consumption is pretty much identical between the XG27AQDMG and other 27-inch 1440p 240Hz W OLEDs. These panels benefit from having a white subpixel, reducing power consumption when viewing full white compared to QD OLEDs. However, in scenes where the white subpixel isn't used as heavily, WOLED and QD OLED power consumption changes quite a bit, to the point where QD OLED can be superior at times. In either case, you're looking at increased power consumption relative to LCDs of the same spec. The XG27AQDMG has identical color space coverage to other WOLED gaming monitors, with 97% coverage of DCI-P3 and around 72% coverage of Rec 2020. That's okay for wide gamut use and HDR gaming, but falls short of competing QD-OLED monitors that sit more in the 80% range. Factory SDR calibration from this monitor was nothing amazing, even after installing firmware version MCM102 that Asus provided a few days ago. The main issues out of the box are a somewhat wonky gamma curve and small color temperature problems, which lead to mediocre delta E's. We also don't get an sRGB gamut clamp enabled by default, so SDR content is oversaturated, a common issue with wide gamut monitors. Relative to other monitors, the XG27AQDMG was a little more accurate than the PG27AQDM from the factory, but fell short of QD-OLED competitors like the Alienware AW2725DF and the MSI 271QRX. For color checker though, most monitors are all in the mid to lower parts of the range, all suffering from oversaturation. Luckily, Asus provide a lot of flexibility with their color modes, including the ability to enable an sRGB gamut clamp without locking out other features. This is in addition to a dedicated sRGB calibration mode, which is the more accurate way to use the display without further setting tweaks. In this mode, the monitor does have a better color temperature, but still suffers from gamma issues. Saturation and color checker performance is around the 5 to 6 delta E ITP range, a huge improvement on the factory mode and bordering on what we consider to be good factory calibration. However, when comparing this to other monitors, the XG27AQDMG still isn't in a particularly strong position for grayscale, delivering similar results to the PG27AQDM, but a much worse result than either of the 360Hz QD OLEDs. Color checker performance is in the mid to lower parts of the chart, while again the two 360Hz models I've tested are chart toppers. It's hard to describe what the Asus monitor provides as especially bad performance, but when the competition is offering elite factory results, comparatively, it does look worse. With that said, there is a lot of scope for calibration through the included settings as well as software ICC profiles. Here's the results I was able to achieve with CalMan, and it looks pretty good for both sRGB and DCI-P3 usage. A lot of this was down to switching the gamma to 2.0, which I would recommend doing. SDR Brightness is an interesting aspect of the XG27AQDMG because Asus claims this panel is 20% brighter than the PG27AQDM for 100% APL SDR usage, while also claiming 275 nits in this configuration. This implies the old model was only good for 220 nits of brightness, even though most reviews, including mine, had it in the 240 to 260 nit range. So is it actually 20% brighter? Not really, although the newer XG model is brighter. In my testing after calibration, I had it at 263 nits, up from 243 nits with the previous model, an 8% increase. This is more in line with my expectations when I saw its advertised 275 nits. The old model is roughly at a 250 nit spec, so that would be a 10% increase, similar to what I saw. My results are just 4% under what Asus advertised, which is within a reasonable tolerance, and before calibration I did see numbers as high as 271 nits, but I don't think claiming 20% higher brightness is especially accurate. It also doesn't really make the XG model much brighter than any other OLED gaming monitors. The AOC AG276QZD, using a previous generation panel, could hit 260 nits, and 360Hz QD OLED models reach 250 nits. There just isn't much difference here between the main panel types. Also, Asus do offer a uniform brightness setting which is not enabled by default, and that caps the monitor to around this 263 nit level for all window sizes, rather than varying brightness as you resize windows, behaviour that I find annoying. Minimum brightness is great at 30 nits. Viewing angles from this display are great. I didn't really have any issues with previous WOLED viewing angles, but Asus are claiming wider viewing angles here, and the results are very decent. Uniformity was also very good, and there appears to be less dirty screen effect than what I experienced on the first generation of 1440p WOLEDs, though it can still be visible in some scenarios. The XG27AQDMG is well suited to HDR from a hardware perspective. OLED panels, including WOLED, directly emit light and have individual pixel control, which makes them ideal for displaying HDR content. This feature allows each pixel to independently vary from fully switching off to displaying bright highlights, giving us deep zero-level blacks and per-pixel local dimming. The level of control OLEDs provide minimizes blooming in high contrast scenarios and allows for clean distinction between bright and dark areas that are close together. Compared to LCDs with a multi-zone backlight, OLEDs have far fewer ugly illumination artifacts, which are most noticeable when displaying difficult scenarios like star fields or subtitles, and there are no zone transitions as bright objects move around the display. With per-pixel control as its main advantage, OLEDs are best at displaying high contrast scenes with rich shadow detail, which is a key aspect to a good HDR presentation. Darker content interspersed with dazzling bright highlights brings out the best in OLED displays, as does HDR content with fast motion. For gamers especially, input latency on most OLEDs is low in the HDR mode. The weakness to the HDR presentation on an OLED is overall brightness. While peak brightness can be high in the best cases, full screen brightness is low, and this limits the punch in bright daytime scenes. LCDs may not have per pixel control, but zoned backlights can simply get significantly brighter in bright scenes. Depending on what you want out of an HDR monitor, your preference could swing more towards LCDs or more towards OLEDs, but typically speaking, OLEDs are a great choice that deliver a fantastic HDR presentation. This monitor comes with several HDR configurations, although the differences in performance are not very substantial. The main mode with the best accuracy is the Gaming HDR mode, which caps brightness to around 750 nits. This can be extended up to over 1000 nits for small elements by enabling the brightness adjustable setting and increasing brightness from 90 to 100. I'm not sure why brightness isn't at 100 by default, but you can enable it if you want to. The default Gaming HDR mode with brightness at 90 has great EOTF tracking and good white balance. The monitor gets a bit too dark in dark scenes, but not to any significant degree. We also see reasonable tracking at larger window sizes like 50%, although roll-off does occur early at these larger windows. Still, this is much better behavior than QD-OLEDs, which have a tendency to dim brighter scenes when used in modes that exceed 450 nits of brightness. Color performance is also reasonable here without being outstanding. When increasing the brightness to 100, now we see peak brightness exceed 1000 nits at a 2% window size. However, the trade-off for this is reduced EOTF tracking accuracy. The monitor doesn't dim like a QD-OLED would, but the darker part of the curve is too dark here, while the brighter part is too bright. At larger window sizes, we don't see as much of the over-brightening aspect, but the dark position of the curve is generally still a bit dark. Color accuracy in this configuration is also somewhat less accurate. In synthetic tests, both XG27AQDMG configurations reach around 265 nits full screen white, which is very similar to other OLED monitors. At a 10% window size, we get 750 nits, which is actually less than the 905 nits seen on the PG27AQDM, though much brighter than competing QD-OLEDs. At a 2% window size, I saw 1100 nits using the max brightness configuration, or 760 nits by default. The brightest configuration is brighter than QD-OLEDs and the PG27AQDM. There's mixed results looking at brightness versus window size charts. The main difference between the two configurations is that by default, brightness is capped to 750 nits above a 10% window, compared to the PG27AQDM. For much of the curve, the newer XG model is brighter, especially for large window sizes. However, between 5% and 25%, the older model is actually better. Then relative to the MSI 271QRX QD-OLED in its brightest configuration, generally the XG OLED is brighter at all window sizes or similar, so that's a good showing from this panel in synthetic tests. Next are our real scene brightness results, and yes, there's a lot going on here. Firstly, in the mid-APL brightness tests on the right, the XG27AQDMG does not aggressively dim brightness in brighter scenes like we see from the QD-OLEDs, whether we use the default or brightest configurations. Every other monitor here is set to use their brightest mode, with a preference for accuracy if there are multiple modes, all offering max brightness. There is a small amount of dimming in some scenarios from the XG, but not to the level of QD-OLEDs, which can cut brightness in half. In addition to no bright scene dimming, the XG model is on average brighter than its QD-OLED competition. In particular, its peak brightness is higher for mid and higher APL scenes. I saw anywhere from 25 to more than 50% better results. However, in darker, lower APL scenes, QD-OLED still has the edge, even though in synthetic tests, the WOLED came out on top. I saw as much as a 16% advantage for the QD-OLED in those tests, but that wasn't enough to make the QD-OLED brighter overall across our 8 sample scenes. I also found that the PG27AQDM was brighter in only 3 of the 8 tests, which makes sense given the newer XG model is brighter for both small and large window sizes. The PG model really only has an advantage in the middle band. Also, this newer XG model is much brighter than older WOLED panels with similar specifications, like the AOC AG276QZD. While the XG27AQDMG is generally brighter for HDR content, the 360Hz QD-OLED monitors are generally more accurate when tested at a 10% window. When using the highest brightness configuration, the AW2725DF in particular is quite a bit more accurate. Then when it comes to color volume, QD-OLEDs have both a wider color gamut and are capable of much higher color brightness, increasing overall color volume substantially. In our new ICTCP test measuring MDC, the MSI271QRX ended up producing a 36% higher result than the XG27AQDMG. Final section of the review is the Hub Essentials checklist. First up, we're looking at how accurately Asus advertised this monitor, and generally they do a good job. Max brightness is quite significantly underestimated at just 450 nits when the panel can achieve over 1000 nits in some circumstances, while P3 coverage and factory calibration are borderline accurate. Unfortunately, like a lot of gaming monitors, response time numbers continue to be misleading, and I'm not a fan of advertising this panel as being 20% brighter for some SDR usage because it's more like 10% brighter. In the feature support matrix, it's no surprise to see this display performing well in the contrast and motion performance sections. Input lag is low and there's even limited ELMB support. However, other features are lacking. There's no USB-C support, text clarity is weak, and Rec 2020 gamut coverage isn't as wide as the best products. Overall, the Asus ROG Strix OLED XG27AQDMG is the most competitive 27-inch 1440p WOLED gaming monitor that I've tested so far. Up against new 360Hz QD-OLED alternatives, and with older models dropping in price, I think Asus have managed to produce a great product that's better than its predecessors in some ways while keeping the price at a reasonable level. The main point of attraction here is the glossy finish, a first for WOLED monitors of this size. This is a great coating that's generally superior to what QD-OLEDs provide, offering better preservation of black levels and the clarity we've come to love from glossy. It's not always going to be the right choice compared to a matte finish, as the reflection handling here isn't amazing for use in brighter rooms, but at least buyers now have a choice to suit their preferences. Being an OLED panel, there are the usual benefits for gamers, including lightning fast response times, a high 240Hz refresh rate, and per pixel control, which provides excellent HDR capabilities. While it's not the fastest OLED going around these days now that QD-OLEDs reach 360Hz, if you're more focused on single-player titles and don't expect to run games at that sort of frame rate, the 240Hz refresh offered here is going to be just fine. HDR performance is pretty good despite not always exceeding or matching the brightness offered by its predecessor, the PG27AQDM. This WOLED panel doesn't suffer from the dimming issues of QD-OLED when run in its brightest configuration, its accuracy is okay, and real scene brightness is better than most OLEDs, especially many previous 1440p WOLEDs. Combined with the glossy panel that many have been requesting, Asus have ticked a lot of boxes. SDR performance is also decent thanks to a wide range of color controls, including a fully unlocked sRGB mode and acceptable though not amazing factory calibration. However, the Subpixel layout still struggles with text rendering, and there's a risk of permanent burn-in when displaying static content, so it's not the best productivity monitor. Asus have attempted to sweeten the deal with several unique features like ELMB, clear pixel edge, and OLED anti-flicker, though for the most part these don't enhance the experience significantly. ELMB is very restrictive and its motion clarity benefits aren't huge, clear pixel edge doesn't improve text clarity, and OLED anti-flicker just nerfs the variable refresh rate range. Meanwhile, features like USB-C, a KVM switch, and Dolby Vision are missing. A price tag of $700 is quite decent, though if this is truly just an introductory price and the MSRP is really $750 US, that's less decent, but still good. I think for most gamers this is clearly the better choice than year-old 1440p WOLEDs like the LG 27GR95QE and AOC AG276QZD, which are also typically seen in the $700 range. The XG27AQDMG simply gets much brighter, it has a decent feature set, and if you like glossy coatings, it's a clear winner. I also think it's worth considering up against 27-inch 1440p 360Hz QD-OLEDs that start at around $800 like the MSI271QRX. Those QD-OLED options have a higher refresh rate that makes them better suited to competitive gaming, along with a better subpixel layout for text rendering. But going with the XG27AQDMG at a lower price gets you a better screen coating, better brightness characteristics, and a still very decent refresh rate for single player or casual gaming. I think it's a really competitive position, and hopefully that will be the case in other regions too. So anyway, that's it for my review of the Asus ROG Strix OLED XG27AQDMG. Hopefully for future versions of this monitor, they shorten that name down a bit, make it a bit snappier and easier to remember. But yeah, glossy WOLEDs, they're now a thing. And yeah, we're not 100% sure how many more panels are going to be produced with the glossy coating. It seems to be a bit experimental at the moment. There are some other things planned in roadmaps and so on, but yeah, we'll have to just wait and see. Hopefully the reception for this is good so that the glossy enthusiasts out there get a few more choices for OLED monitors. Anyway, if you do appreciate this review and all the testing that we do here at Monitors Unboxed, then please do consider supporting our independent testing and reviews via our Patreon and Float Plan accounts. Links are in the description below. You'll also get a couple of cool benefits in return, like our monthly live streams. We've got our BTS content and our Discord channel, which is a great place to chat about monitors, get recommendations, all that sort of thing. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.